Hi, how you doing? I've just got back from Fight Camp, a 3-day event where I've been teaching classical pugilism and Elizabethan backsword. And one of the major topics of conversation that seemed to crop up quite a lot was the use of gloves in bare knuckle boxing, the use of gloves in boxing as opposed to bare knuckle boxing. And I thought it would be very interesting to make a video on it to give you my thoughts on that and how that applies to professional MMA, because there does appear to be a bit of a move towards competitions without gloves. There are some people, primarily in the States, who are looking at creating competitions for bare knuckle boxing. And there are some people who are pushing for the UFC to remove gloves from their competitions. I thought that the first thing that you kind of need to know if you're going to talk about gloves in combat sport is the kind of the historical context. So what you need to bear in mind is that originally gloves weren't used at all in training or in competition. And it was only when Jack Broughton introduced his rules after killing a man in the ring that gloves were started to be introduced in sparring. Now, only in friendly sparring. So in training, no. And in proper competition, definitely not. And it wasn't until the Marquis of Queensberry's rules were introduced in the 19th century that gloves became part of the competition. For a while, the London prize ring and the Marquis of Queensberry's rules ran side by side, but eventually the London prize ring fell away. And that was for a number of reasons. The first thing is that gloves protect your skin. Your face is much more likely to get cut if you're fighting someone who isn't wearing gloves. Gloves distribute the force over a wider area, and therefore they don't apply as much pressure on the skin directly. When the skin splits when you're fighting, that's because it gets crushed between two bony prominences, so the bones of the hand and the bones of the skull. Now that will still happen in boxing and MMA to a degree, but usually around the orbit, so you get a lot of cuts around the eyebrow because there's a sharp ridge of bone there, and you don't have to apply that much pressure for that sharp ridge to split the skin above it. And that's pretty common. And we can see that in MMA that happens a lot more than in boxing. When you look at Robbie Lawler's most recent title defense, there were a lot of cuts to both fighters, and there was a lot of blood. It looked incredibly gory, but in actual fact, neither of those fighters suffered a huge amount of significant damage. Everything was relatively superficial. Their faces were swollen, there were a lot of cuts, and there was a lot of bleeding, but both fighters were able to hold a pretty rational conversation at the end of the fight. And that's often not the case if somebody's had that kind of damage done internally to their brain. So gloves prevent these superficial injuries, but more importantly than that, gloves protect the hands. The fact is that this, at least structurally and skeletally, is significantly more fragile than this. So if I hit somebody in the head hard with an ungloved hand, the chances are the thing that's going to get damaged is this and not this. So that massively changes the game. It takes away the need for power generation, and modern boxing is all about generating as much power as possible and putting that power into your opponent, trying your hardest to knock them out. Bare knuckle boxing, classical pugilism, at least in its original form, wasn't about that. It was about speed and precision and accuracy. And there are areas of the body that I can hit very, very safely with my hand, including areas on the head, that will do damage to my opponent and that won't damage me. But hitting them in a very specific way is very important, and if you get it wrong, then you're in big trouble. And gloves and wraps give you that leeway, so that if you hit the wrong target area, if your opponent moves and you hit with your fist at the wrong angle and you hit with a bit of your hand that you weren't intending to, that's not as big a deal if you've got a nice padded glove on, because the pressure is distributed through the hand. If you aren't wearing a glove, however, that becomes a very big deal. If you've ever done any combat sports for any length of time, you'll come across people who've broken their knuckles. I've done it myself. Back in the days when I was doing karate, I didn't understand the anatomy and physiology of my hand, and I broke the fifth metacarpal, actually on both my hands over the years. And that's an absolute classic striking injury. In orthopedics, it's known as a boxer's fracture. And you'll see it's quite common in boxers who punch without gloves on. So if a boxer, however skilled they are, gets into a brawl without gloves, they're going to punch the way they've trained to, and they're going to damage their hand. Nazim Hamad had a boxer's fracture, and I suspect if I were to do the research, I'd find a lot of other top-level, very skilled, very successful boxers who had boxer's fractures. The fact is, boxing does not teach you how to punch in such a way to protect your hands. So that will change the game. But how does it change the game? And I think we can look at the UFC and we can see how that changes the game. If we look at the early UFC competitions, where gloves weren't compulsory, we had a very different sort of fight, and one style of fighting was hugely dominant, and that's grappling. And I think a lot of the credit that goes to Royce Gracie and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stems from the fact that striking wasn't as effective at that point. And that's not to take away from grappling as an art. I grapple. I personally train in catch wrestling, and I understand quite how terrifying it is to be facing a skilled grappler. I've trained with some guys that do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at various belt levels, and some of them are incredibly good. So I'm not in any way attempting to suggest that Royce isn't an incredibly skilled fighter. He clearly is. But what I'm saying is that he was in exactly the right place at the right time, because people weren't able to strike as effectively as they might have liked, and that then left him able to play to his strengths, and he did. And he was hugely dominant, and it became very clear that grappling was more important than striking. And over the years, as gloves became part of the UFC, striking has come back into, and I wouldn't say dominance, but certainly parity. And I think if we remove gloves from the UFC, we will protect the fighters. They'll certainly get a lot more superficial damage, they'll get a lot more lacerations to the face, they'll get more hand injuries, but they'll get much, much fewer soft tissue injuries to the brain. And that, I think, is the important thing. It's okay to have a cut, you can stitch it, maybe take some antibiotics if it looks like it's getting infected, and it will heal nicely. But if your brain gets injured inside your skull, that's not going to happen. It doesn't just heal up by itself. That's a cumulative damage that grows over time, and then you're in trouble. And if you fight, if you train, you'll know as well as I do that sometimes you get home after training and you've got that nagging headache that won't really go away. You find it difficult to concentrate, and that's mild concussion, and that's a sign of actual physical damage to your brain. So imagine what's going on at that top level when people are fighting 7, 8, 9, 10 times a year at the top level. With gloves on, fighters are able to hit them hard. They're accumulating significant brain injury over time. And that becomes a much lower risk if gloves aren't part of the equation. So I think it's safer for the fighters. It'll look worse, but it'll be better. It'll play into the hands of the grapplers a little bit more, because obviously ground fighting is the main difference between modern MMA and classical pugilism. There was no ground fighting in pugilism. When somebody hit the ground, the round finished, you started again. So it was playing to a degree towards the strikers. But the grapplers will certainly have a big advantage. To start looking at more effective, more precise ways of striking. So that's pretty much all I've got to say on the subject. I hope I've not been too boring. My personal view is that I would love to see MMA fought without gloves. I'd love to see a resurgence of the type of striking that was carried out during the classical pugilism period, and I suspect that it would evolve by itself, even if nobody tried to do it, if gloves were taken out of competition. I don't think they will be, because I think it's far easier to ignore injuries you can't see, and far harder to ignore injuries that are obvious. And I think that much like in the pugilistic period, amateur level competition is very popular. Going down to the gym and training in MMA is something a lot of people do. And those people don't want facial scars. They don't want to damage their hands. So they want to train in gloves. And they're probably not going to get any brain damage. But because those are the people that are making money for the promotions, they're the people that buy the tickets, that buy the clothes, that buy the replicas, that buy into the whole UFC or ONE FC or Bellator or whoever it is. They buy into the promotions and they follow the fighters and they make a lot of money for a lot of people. They're the people who are going to set the standards for fighting. So I don't think that gloves will be taken out of the UFC or out of MMA competitions full stop. I think they should be, and I'd love to see it happen. And I think that fighters would have longer careers, and I think that they would finish their careers in a much better physical state. And I think that it's morally the right thing to do, but I don't think it's going to happen because it's not pretty. Anyway, I hope this has been of some interest to you. Look out for more videos. There's all sorts of things that cropped up at Fight Camp that I want to talk about, and I'll have some reviews. Please check out the links below, pugilism.org, backsword.org, and my Patreon link. It'd be really nice if you could support me in some way in making these videos. And to those of you who I saw at the weekend who came and told me that you're subscribing to my channel, thank you. I really, really appreciate it. Tell your friends, get everybody subscribed, and I'll see you around.